Hi, my name is Caroline Hawkshaw, and I'll be presenting my video right now on the insanity defense of the American Law Institute. So that's on pages 621 to 624 of the book Philosophy of Law, which is a textbook by Joel Feinberg and Jules Coleman. The insanity defense has to do with most mental health factors that affect criminals, so it just protects them under this. This defense is seen more as an excuse to why people do the things they do when that specific action cannot be justified by any factors. So if you're committing a crime, this would protect you if you did have like mental health issues confining you to commit the act. So I've also heard this defense be called the mental disorder defense, as it relates to why someone acted the specific way they did. This can otherwise be explained as blaming the conviction of an individual on their mental state due to their suffering state within their mental illness battle. Because some people don't get the proper care for their mental illness battles and they act out on them. So I'll be first beginning with going into depth regarding Article 4 of Responsibility, which is Section 4.01, titled Mental Disease or Defect Excluding Responsibility. And then this is divided into 6 parts, but the first point of the article explains how a person is not liable for criminal activity if at the time of their conduct they lose the substantial ability either to understand the wrongdoing of this conduct or to adapt his conduct to the provisions of the law due to their mental illness or defect. So this reading really highlighted like mental disorder and defect instead of saying like mental illness. But the second part of this article explains what mental disease or defect is defined as. So according to the American Law Institute, it just highlighted like what it does include and then what it doesn't. So it doesn't include repeated offenses or antisocial conduct. This means like if somebody were to complete a crime twice, they would not be able to blame their conviction on their mental health status like both times. This is so no one takes advantage of the defense, because there are people out there who just want to say that they committed an act due to their mental illness, but they're actually not suffering from anything at all. So the next part of the reading, this is where it's divided into the 6 parts. That was just like a backstory of like what the defense really is about. So these 6 parts, they regard the problem of defining the criteria of irresponsibility. So I'll just go into like each part and I'll just like highlight like what I found important from each part. So the first part explains how that although it is hard to put an extent as to how far a mental state can be classified, there needs to be a point where people cannot just blame their convictions on their mental state just because they want their conviction to be dismissed. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier about how people, they just think wrong and they think they can get out of things just because mental health exists and everybody suffers from mental health, even though there are people who have it worse than others. So it's incredibly hard to determine if the specific actions of an individual should be excused on the grounds that they were suffering immensely from a mental illness or defect at the time in which they behaved poorly. So they wouldn't know that they're committing like an act that is deemed as wrong. So the issue that poses is the drawing of the line between public agency use and public power to prosecute the criminal, with the resulting penalties containing an extrapolable coercive element. So this just means that there needs to be a line between like what people think publicly about mental illness and then how public power is used to prosecute the criminal. So even though restriction and restraints may be used within the conviction, that just acts to justify that these people are still criminals. They will just receive a different sanction than those who would have committed their act on a voluntary basis, which would be just like normal. You're not suffering from any consequences or anything. So when police are like hurting the person or trying to get them to stop doing whatever they were doing, they still need to act like criminals. They're gonna act on these criminals just as they would like anybody else. So the second part of the 6 parts involves the McNaughty rule. So the McNaughton rule states that individuals who commit a crime due to their mental health status will not be proven guilty. So this is just another statement of them being protected. So the individual, so were so lost within the state that they could not control their actions, and they should be not held. They shouldn't be held accountable for these actions because of this. So this rule exists like solely to make sure that the individual thinks whether their action was morally wrong or not, and in most cases they don't know that what they're doing is actually wrong. So basically the individual cannot have restrained their act because they did not know that it was wrong at the time due to their mental state. Then there are specific scenarios explained in the second part. So this kind of reminded me of a popular Netflix show called Orange is the New Black, and how there was a specific character who was covered regarding her own mental health, and how it was so overwhelming to the point where she couldn't control her wrongdoings. So the character is named Suzanne, and she's in prison due to taking home a child from the park, and mentally she was not able to understand that it was wrong to be friends with children when you're an adult. Since there's a child involved, he could not tell that he was doing wrong either. And then when he wanted to go home, she thought he did not want to be friends with her anymore, resulting in her forcibly taking the phone he was using to call his parents on. He then becomes scared and tries to back up from Suzanne, and he eventually falls off the balcony, ending in a tragic death. She was charged for his death, but her mental state was also taken into consideration. So she couldn't really control these feelings of like, oh, you can't be friends with like different age groups, like that's looked down upon and it's morally wrong. So she just thought she thought that she was taking him home just to like have a play date and like hang out and stuff, but in reality that's not what it is, and most people would deem that as morally wrong. So I just wanted to get that out there, is like that's what I thought about when I was reading about the insanity defense. Like that just like related to me. And so then I'm just going to move into now the third part, which discusses the specific viewpoint of strict punitive penalties and how they must account for the impairment of mental cognition. So this just means that you must be impaired like to a specific state. Like you don't have to be impaired fully, but I cover this later in another part. But the outcome should be reached immediately in the specification of the test. So you're going to be tested like on your mental health state and like what you thought was wrong and what you thought you were doing. So this would involve psychiatrists to evaluate the mental state of the individual before the individual could be actually pronounced as guilty. So there were two main formulations recommended within the text. So I thought I would just go over those because those were really interesting to me. So the first formulation was to consider if the suspect lacked the capacity to adapt his actions to legal standards in this branch of investigation. So the second formulation instead posed the situation in which considered if the criminal had the capacity to adhere his behavior to the provisions of the statute. So it questions whether the impact of imprisonment may have had a major restraining effect on them due to their mental illness or defect. So if they were imprisoned or not, that would just depend on the jury and what they think is the best for that individual. So the fourth part highlights how a criminal should not know that their action they have committed was wrong. So I would say this kind of reflects back on the last one and what I've been saying kind of prior. Like the individual doesn't know what's happening to them. Like their mental illness just like overcomes them. So they're kind of like distorted from reality. So their distortion of reality must have been so severe that their actions could not have been controlled at all. So sometimes such authorities, such as police, will not be able to tell that the individuals committed their crime due to a mental illness state of mind. This is where psychiatrists begin their evaluations. Psychiatrists believe that the individual must have suffered substantial impairment from their state of mind, not a full impairment. I kind of talked about this earlier too. Like it just backs up the fact that even if you're suffering a little bit from mental health, that will be taken into consideration as well. It makes it easier for people who suffer from mental illness to get their sanctions lowered as well. And this kind of just flows into the fifth part, which kind of deals with the opposite of this, which I thought was also interesting to see, like, what other people think, like, about this, because I personally am vouching for, like, mental health. So the fifth part deals with the opposite, which is the excused is not criminally responsible if his unlawful act was the product of mental disease or defect. So if the individual had not suffered from a mental illness, he would not have done the same action. This is basically stating that mental health is a controllable idea. However, obviously it is not, with all the instances that date back to centuries ago where people have not received the proper mental health care and have acted out against their will, although they were, of course, still in their body. The last part is basic, as it defines how psychopathic personality cannot be covered under this defense. The rationale for this submission is that a psychopathic person differs from an average person immensely. I feel like anybody could tell this anyways, that is why, psychopath is, defined is different from normal people. So psychopathic behavior comes with no indication of the specific person's abnormalities. So they're things that are not normal, so they're triggers and stuff, and it does not carry an explanation of the causes. That's why it's not covered under the defense, because you can't explain it as a mental health factor when you're acting on it. So I just wrote a summary of what I thought at the end after explaining the 6 parts, what I have to say about mental health and what I got from the article in the reading. So if you have this sort of mental disability, you can escape reality easily due to your inability to keep your mind on track. This is something you cannot control, obviously. With this said, guilt is not always a condition of punishment. If someone commits a crime, I believe that they should be able to explain their story. If they cannot explain their story, then maybe mental health issues must blame. There needs to be a distinction discussed between what is criminal and what is not criminal. Everyone deserves a fair chance at trial, especially if they were not in control of their actions at the time. Every case is different, but this defense makes it possible for those with mental illness to bypass their actions. After all, they had no control of their actions at the time of the incident. They are people too and must be protected by laws as well. This is why the defendants must also prove that they did not understand or had control of what they were doing. This is the same for normal people as well. So there is no favoritism within the defense, because I've heard that there are people who don't believe that mental health is a real issue in the world, but the individual must fail to know that their action was wrong. They did not know morally that they were doing something wrong. This is different from a normal person. Obviously, as a normal person can tell the difference between right and wrong and do their action willingly. Mental health has been a major issue in the world for centuries. With this defense, it is possible that there is justice served for those who are unfortunately suffering. So with this defense, people are helped who are suffering from mental illness, and it is a big issue in the world today. Mental health has always been an issue, but during COVID, I feel it's more of an issue, as people are just in their houses all the time and they don't really know what's going on the outsides, and they just get really anxious, and mental health has just been suffering a lot recently. So I felt this was an important reading to discuss right now. So thank you for listening.